In video games, there are characters, weapons, cosmetics, all kinds of collectibles. Some require players' effort, while some require spending. They are just a collection of pixels, but why exactly do these virtual items feel so significant to us? To answer this question, it is very easy to write it off as emotional attachment, but this barely scratches the surface. The real solution lies within a few psychological mechanisms that are centered around value perception. The first one I want to introduce is the Endowment Effect. It describes when a person values something more highly simply because he owns them. That means the maximum amounts the person would pay to acquire an object is usually lower than the least amounts they are willing to accept to give up that same object. The endowment effect is often explained in part by loss aversion, which is a psychological tendency to feel the pain of loss much more acutely than the pleasure of a gain that has similar value. The endowment effect can be further strengthened by status quo bias, exposure effects, and emotional attachment. The status quo bias is the tendency for people to prefer keeping the things the way they currently are, even if changing will result in something objectively better. Once an item becomes ours, keeping it becomes the default state, while giving it up is equivalent to a change, and people naturally resist changes to the status quo. The exposure effect states that the more often we encounter something, the more we tend to like it, even if we didn't like it at first. In video games, you can use or simply look at your digital items as many times as you want, and this repeated exposure makes us more attached to the item itself. As we can see, these psychological mechanisms are connected and they reinforce each other, and yet, the endowment effect and the other mechanisms I've covered so far are just a small part of the whole picture. Moving on to the next mechanism, which is the confirmation bias. The link between this and the value perception may not be obvious, but this is a key link between the exposure effects, endowment effects, and identity, which will be covered in the next section. Interestingly, it is actually easy for us to recognize our emotional attachments to something, and we feel the need to justify this attachment. That's where the confirmation bias comes into play. Let's use an example of a character's skin. We see cool animations, compliments from other players, or simply how it stands out. These are all evidence our brain selectively collects to justify the idea that this skin is special, but during the process, we've ignored that there are other skins that look just as good, or even neglect the fact that we could simply be affected by the exposure effects. And when we justify and believe the idea that this skin is special, our perception of its value becomes further reinforced. If something is special, it must be valuable. And on top of that, we are highlighting all of the supporting evidence that demonstrates its positive qualities, which further increases our value perception of the skin. In real life, we often see people using possessions to express who they are, such as with clothing, cars, decorations, accessories, and more. But virtual items work in the exact same way. In video games, there can be limited items, event-exclusive items, or other kinds of rare cosmetic items. Each of them contains their own story and can be seen as part of the owner. For example, a launch day badge can show that the player has been there since the beginning, or perhaps they went on and collected a few other badges from exclusive events or even the game's anniversary. This means that the player has been active and sticking with the game for years. Even though the badges don't do anything practically, they are still valuable to the player because of what they represent. These badges represent experiences and achievements. If those badges were to disappear suddenly, it would feel like losing much more than its value, because those badges have already become part of the player. The next mechanism is memory attachment. Virtual items can represent status, but they can also contain memory. It can be your very first rare gear, your very first rare character, or your very first exclusive skin. The connection of memory attachments to exposure effects is strong because the virtual item acts as a memento. The more you see it, the more you get reminded of the memory, and that reinforces your attachment to the item and raises the value perception. The item becomes more than what it is. It acts as a memento containing our precious memories. Losing the item feels like losing a part of us. That's why players are more attached to the memories associated with the item rather than the item itself. The final piece that connects everything is psychological ownership. It describes the feeling that something belongs to us even when we don't actually own the item. Imagine that a limited time event is giving out a free item, but players are required to do tasks for it. When facing this, you naturally think that since the item is free, everyone's supposed to get it, and the item is yours to take. The obstacles between you and the exclusive item often feels less than it actually is. At that point, giving up doesn't feel like missing a reward, it feels like missing something that actually belongs to you. Digital ownership is not inherently bad. On the contrary, attachment to virtual items is what makes games meaningful. However, this attachment is often used against us in modern games. Once players become emotionally attached to their accounts and their collection, game designers start leveraging the attachments to influence behavior. For instance, special items obtainable from a limited time event doesn't require any spending, but players are still incentivized to play and grind for the items. That's not only because of the fear of missing out. The players are protecting a future part of their identity from never existing in the first place. Missing the item can feel like losing something before it was ever owned. With the cost of the item being marked as free, it is even easier for players to justify their efforts and time investments. Another example is actually battle passes. As players level up, They begin to feel ownership over rewards they have not yet unlocked. Abandoning the progress doesn't feel like walking away from optional rewards. It feels like giving up something that already belongs to them. Because leveling up only costs effort, and it is again easy for the players to justify their investments. These systems are so effective precisely because they don't rely on the value of the items themselves but rather the psychological value the players have attached to them through ownership, memories, and identity. Games don't always sell items, they sell the fear of losing a future memory, and a future part of the identity that players are trying to build within the game, and all of the psychological mechanisms covered in this video coming into play, and significantly enhancing the perceived value and attachment towards those items. That's all from me for today. I hope this video has been informative and entertaining. If you have anything to add, make sure to add them in the comments below. Thanks for watching.